Pass around the pot, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Indeed it is. It is showtime. Welcome in. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Dave Trafford here. It is February the 14th, and all the love is going to come out of Northern Ontario today because of the leaders' debate. And I, right off the bat, I just want to make a correction. I got on John Moore's show this morning and said the Premier wasn't going to be at the Northern Region debate, and he is. Mea culpa. It's on me. It was a bad mistake. So away we go. It doesn't necessarily change my posture on Tories not showing up at local candidates debates, but that's for another day. We'll get into that later on the program. Yes, we are getting ready for the debate, and by the way, it's a live event on News Talk 1010 Monday after the debate. We'll be live from 8 until 9. That will be the podcast, but we'll also have a pre-game show, so stay in the feed, and we'll get you what you need. So today, a little bit different. We're going to have our panel coming in here presently, but in the meantime, yesterday, we were hoping to get TIm Hudak on because he was in Washington this week when the premiers were down there and with their tin cups or whatever it was they had, and they were trying to convince others that we needed to pay attention vis-a-vis the tariffs and so on, and so we made an effort, and Tim, we tried to get you on the Uber tour yesterday, but signals being what they were with the snow day and all, but we did want to make sure we got your insights, just your own off the top of your head, on a scale of 1 to 10, where did that rank first for the messaging around it? Because yesterday, Amanda Galbraith was a little concerned that some of the messaging got lost, and she even said that that the meeting that they finally got with the premiers together was she qualified. It looked like the hillbillies going to Washington D.C. So it was a little off message that the whole we are interested or we're not committing to the 51st state, etc. There was a lot of messiness around it in the final message. So anyway, just wanted your take on it.
Well, number one, it was just frankly really cool to be there, right? To be there on behalf of Counsel Public Affairs and being on side with Canadian and American businesses supporting Ontario Premier's Doug Ford's Ontario Days. And the goal, Dave, was to communicate with Americans, because if we're going to get a better deal, Americans need to push back against their president and the administration to allow that. There's three things that I really had as takeaways. Number one, Doug Ford's message was right on. Like, he talked about what he calls Fortress AMCAN. And basically, Dave, it's a plan to grow the Canadian and the American economy, to have stronger mutual defense, to turn our trade guns on China, which is breaking the rules, not on each other, and get a better immigration system that doesn't allow people into either of our countries that want to do damage. Ford delivered it in a statesmanlike tone. It was more, when he talked about the administration under Trump, of sadness as opposed to anger, and a genuine affection for Americans and Canadians alike. So when I looked around the room, the Americans in the room, their heads were nodding. So I thought Premier Ford actually did have mission accomplished when it comes to what he's trying to advance in Washington, D.C. Number two observation, here's the challenge. In talking to Americans, and whether they're elected, staff, what have you, a lot of them, Dave, say, we agree with you. It's crazy to be going after Canada. We don't get it. But we're not going to stick our heads up. We're not going to speak out about it yet. Because Trump has so much power, a reputation for being vengeful, a lot of momentum, they appear to be scared. Observation number three, similarly, the American crowd said, we really don't know what the president is up to, right? Does he actually want to make Canada the 51st state? Is it a deal he wants to make? And if it's a deal, what's it all about? My takeaways? Means this is going to be a roller coaster, 4 to 6 months. But at the end of the day, I actually remain optimistic that momentum will come around on our side, and this is the first part of the push.
Yeah, the push is going to be a push and pull. I mean, to some degree, based on the way it's going, and every day there seems to be a whole new headline around tariffs, how that's going to be affected. And yesterday we were talking. I asked John Tory about this, and I said, I understand that in the moment, on this date, the tariffs take effect and everybody's is paying attention. But yesterday we had a clip from the premier, and he was pointing out the capacity for aluminum, for example, that the Americans need, I forget what the number was, 5 million tons of aluminum a year, and they only have the capacity to make 750,000, and they get 3 million tons from Quebec. So in the short term, the Americans don't have the capacity to tool up and deal with that aluminum shortage. You've been watching this more closely than others. Where's the tipping point there? Because in the short term, the Americans are still going to have to buy Quebec's aluminum at a higher cost. And if, in fact, the tariffs are later, that's going to be a huge cost. Where's the tipping point there where all of a sudden, we're in the negative and that's just going to stop? They're going to turn the tap off because it'll be a while before they can actually tool up to have the manufacturing for aluminum processing in the United States.
Yeah, again, two observations from being there in D.C., one around Premier Ford's messaging, and secondly, around your point on American understanding and what I think we misunderstand as Canadians. Ford was also very effective in telling stories. He talked about the aluminum cans. He talked about autos crossing the border, up to 8 times before they get into the driver's hands. He talked about the critical minerals. So he actually was very successful in making that link in simple to understand stories. And even some Americans said to me, that was very Trumpian, which is a good thing, right? When you're in D.C. these days. And number two, I think we fundamentally misunderstand, Dave, that it's really not about Canada. Yeah, we pop up on the X feed or Truth Social from time to time. But I think this is really about the Americans trying to change the order when it comes to international trade, to try to just change the way we've done things since World War II. And, I think our goal in Canada should be to get inside of that fence. If they're going to put up a fence of tariffs and trade restrictions to advance foreign policy, economic policy, to go after unfair trade practices, our goal should be get on the inside. Because this administration is so busy, such an ambitious agenda, it's Ukraine one day, Gaza the next, right? Elon Musk, that's going to take some time. And we can have some fun, who they met with in the White House, but those efforts, just grinding it out, getting Americans to talk to Americans, I do believe that will get us inside that fence.
Yeah, and then the last thing that you can actually call on anybody to have is patience when we're in a state of uncertainty. Though there is the real secret sauce, right? And election aside, federally and provincially, that is going to be, the challenge of the path for the next 8 months. No?
Yeah, it's a roller coaster. There's going to be ups, downs, and these scary dips, twisting curves. I do think we hit flat track, but you're probably looking, at least 6 months before we get there. It is just hard to cut through in the States. You got to get at it. I do think there'll be some short-term pain, both in Canada and in the States, to capture more attention from the Americans, whether that ups the inflation, impacts the stock market. I think that's going to happen as one of these dips on the roller coaster, but ultimately I remain positive. And to bring it back to the Ontario election, look, in a purely tactical way, this worked for Ford. Another 2 or 3 days talking about Donald Trump, tariffs, protecting Ontario, and Captain Canada. He's striking the right tone. And at Counsel Public Affairs, we did some recent polling while this was happening. And, no surprise, we found the Conservatives had 46% across Ontario, the Liberals 25%, New Democrats 20%. And despite the fact that many issues are underwater for Ford, he's on his way to a third majority government.
Yeah, Leger did the polling for you, right? Is that who did it?
Exactly. Yeah. Cooperate with Leger. We looked at issues too. So the top 4 issues in Ontario, first was healthcare off the top. Second was the cost of living. Third was jobs in the economy. And fourth was housing. And all of those, Premier Ford was underwater, with far more people saying they've had a poor performance than a good performance. Fifth was standing up to Trump. So despite being in the negative territory in those first 4 major issues, Merritt Stiles and Bonnie Crombie are not capitalizing on that. And Ford's moving ahead.
Yeah, and I've heard that a few times in the various polling that's gone out. And we can say, well, this poll is wrong, or, they're not consistent. But what they are consistent is in that top number, and which is interesting, and it's not moving despite, as you point out, this not even uncertainty. We're not satisfied, it seems, generally, with the job that the Ford government is doing. Have you ever seen that kind of calculus or, math before in terms of how you survive politically? I mean, there's...
Yeah, it's wild. That's why our analysis called it the implausible three-peat. First, three majority governments in a row has not been done, I think, since Leslie Frost in 1950. So, first of all, pretty hard hill to climb. But secondly, to be behind on the top four issues significantly and still have a substantial lead is incredible. So in partnership with Regehr, we dug into the why, Dave, and if listeners and viewers want to see it, they can go to counselpa.com and see the full analysis. But believe it or not, when it comes to healthcare, Doug Ford was seen as better than Crombie or Stiles. The biggest category was we don't know or none of the above.
Right, yeah.
So Ford actually was either even or better in those weaker categories than the leaders. And there's no doubt that the PC ads going after Bonnie Crombie did solidify some negatives for her. She's seen as not being good on the cost of living and by far the most likely to raise taxes.
And this is the geeky, wonkish question, and we've sort of touched on it as, you've been in and out of the podcast over the last couple of weeks. Here we are into prep weekend for the debate. Is it more or less likely that this debate is going to have a significant or an effect to move the needle perceptibly in the next week?
Look, it's an opportunity for one of the opposition leaders to break through. And, what I'd advise for Bonnie Crombie is focus and prosecute the case when it comes to healthcare, to stand out as the leader of the opposition and as best as you can, ready to govern. I think the Liberal campaign has been too scattergun. So focus on lack of doctors, hallway medicine, and Ford's failures to fix that job. And Myra Stiles, incredibly likable, good energy. So some advice for her is to maybe just talk past Doug Ford. Don't be the second attack dog. Just basically shrug and say the premier he has failed. And we want to actually make life more affordable for you, more jobs, to talk positively about our plan and tell stories.
Well, yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting session, and we all always say that in the business that we're in as we head into the debates, because we kind of get giddy and get the popcorn going, and that's one thing. But I just sense that this might be a little bit of a different environment. So looking forward to hearing what you think post debate on Monday. And just as everybody knows, we will be doing a podcast Monday after the debate from 8 until 9 Eastern time. And it will be live on News Talk 1010. That will be the audio version. We're not going to subject the radio guys to having to figure out how to do video because, we just don't want to get them out of their lane. But so wherever you listen to your podcasts, that's where you will find us. And, of course, TIm Hudak, is the former PC Ontario leader and a partner at Counsel Public Affairs, will be there. And thanks for making time for us this morning. Good to talk to you, Tim.
My pleasure. We'll see you Monday night.
All right, and just a reminder, if there's things in the program that you want to comment on, you can go to my website, davetrafford.com, go to the On the Ledge page there, and you can see the talkback button. Hit the button. You've got 90 seconds. That's a long time. Whatever's on your mind, you want to jump in and have your say, by all means do so. And we vet the recordings, and for those that are suitable and we can include in some of the shows, we're happy to do that. So davetrafford.com, On the Ledge is the page. Hit the talkback button and jump into the conversation. We'd love to hear what you have to say. And, of course, this is the daily edition of On the Ledge. And, if you are listening on Apple, Spotify, iHeart, etc., maybe you're watching on YouTube, you'll notice that I've got I'm getting ready for Flag Day. I've got my Canada sweatshirt on here. And I know the other day John Wright was talking about his Canada flag, getting ready for Flag Day. So for those of you who are out there and about, do your thing, and that'll be all good. All right, let's get to the panel. Back at it again around the table this week, today, actually, for the daily edition. Neil Hetherington is here from Daily Bread Food Bank, and Sheila Regehr is here from the Basic Income Network. And, of course, he's always here. He is our resident pollster and founding member of On the Ledge. John Wright is here. And I think, just before you guys came in, I was talking to TIm Hudak, and Tim was in Washington this week while the premiers were down there, with whether it was tin cup in hand or whatever process they were going through to try and make sure that our messages here on this side of the border were cutting through, et cetera. And, for the most part, John, he shared the thoughts of the crew yesterday that it played well for the premier, but still the challenge is cutting through all of the noise down there, everything else that's going on. And it was just even one clip from the premier who was talking about it. And, how do we approach this? How do we frame the message? The premier kind of framed it up the way Tim did and said it's really hard to kind of cut through and make sure that we're getting the message through to the right people to hear it.
Well, I think both sides have to take a diplomatic approach. They have to listen. The worst thing that could happen to American citizens and Canadian citizens, that it turns out to a full-out tariff war. It'd be terrible. Both sides would get hurt. People would be getting laid off at their jobs, and we just want to make sure we inform the people of the U.S. how serious this really is. I think every Canadian wakes up. All 40 million wake up hearing about tariffs, worried about tariffs. I can tell you, whatever, the 350 million people aren't waking up worrying about tariffs.
Yeah, and therein lies the challenge, right, John?
Well, yeah, but there's a few things to be said on that. Number one is that the retail sales for January are out today in the United States and show a very sharp drop-off. This week as well, inflation was also seen to go up. So it's now sitting at 3% in the United States, which means that there won't be a rate cut from the Fed. So what we're seeing now is actually Americans starting to pull in their horns. We're seeing inflation starting to rise. So whatever Mr. Trump's talking about, and there's some polling that shows that, again, the Republican base doesn't understand what tariff means to their country and the expense it's going to put on their own backs. There will come an issue at some point where the economy itself and consumers have a certain expectation that the country may be moving ahead, but in fact, it's actually moving in reverse. And we're starting to see that play out behind the scenes in some reporting that took place last night, showing that there is some tension growing within the White House in terms of the extent of what these tariffs should do and when they should be implemented, because what seemed imminent now may be even pushed off to April. So, it's that whole thing about trying to move ahead with a project, but then getting caught up in reality. So that's the first thing. The second thing, though, is, a lot of what is playing out in Washington is played for domestic consumption here. Yes, you can have people going on CNN and giving ultimatums to the president of the United States, but he doesn't care. He's not listening. He's not listening to every major. He's not even listening to Zelensky at the moment. So, it doesn't matter. So when you're down there, you're playing to this audience. And when you look at the polling, if it had been just a regular election campaign, the top issues would be things like healthcare and education and all the other things that we normally talk about. 53% of people in Ontario believe that this government is best suited to deal with that issue that he's talking with. It just cuts through everything. So from a provincial point of view, from an international point of view, it's all focused back here on the campaign. And the only thing I would say to at the end of all of that is that I think the Ontario government itself has got to be doing maybe what the federal government is doing behind the scenes, and that's opening up doors to other places. You can't just be knocking on and pounding on the White House door and expecting to get anywhere. You've got to be pivoting very carefully with the Department of coordinating federally, but you've got to be, as an Ontario government, making sure you're opening doors to other places, because inevitably in the next 60 days or so, many of those routes may be shut down, and some of them are already shutting on things like steel and aluminum. We're going to have our own issues to deal with, and we can't depend anymore on the United States.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, and I've heard more than one person, Neil, harken back to it feels like the uncertainty and the ill at ease we felt around the pandemic. When we first kind of got into that, there was a level of uncertainty. It was existential. All of those things. It's a very different circumstance, but that level of anxiety, I think, is easy to underestimate the deeper effect. And I know you're still seeing some of that reckoning at the food bank in terms of the aftermath and the effects of pandemic. Just give me a sense of how, if at all, any of this uncertainty, any of this anxiety, instability, whatever we want to call it, chaos, plays into how you guys are managing your day-to-day effort to make sure that people are fed at the food bank.
Oh, there's so much in there, Dave. So when the pandemic hit, it was a rallying cry. We all got together as food banks, but as a province, we got together, and in many ways, we appreciated the leadership role that the premier had there. So he has the benefit or the good fortune or the luck of having this additional crisis or potential crisis where many Ontarians are going to rally behind him on that. And we, as a message from the food bank, have been struggling to get out there and say, the people who are most affected by these crises are the ones that we're serving. They are the first ones to be kicked out of the economy and the last ones to be brought back into the economy. And we saw very clearly lineups at the food bank during the pandemic, a kilometer long over at New Toronto Street at the Daily Bread. And that happened, 5 days into the shutdown. And so it was an outward sign of a lack of resiliency that Ontarians had. And we promised one another we were going to build back better, but we didn't. And so then another potential acute shock to the system happens, or the threat of it happens. And we didn't build back better. And those most vulnerable will be the first ones back at the food bank, continuing the growth that we've had. And to be very clear, they never went away from the food bank. Our numbers continue to grow since the pandemic at a rate right now of around 10,000 new people every single month coming to the Daily Bread, just in Toronto alone.
It's interesting to me, Sheila, that we're starting to pay attention to this, and the parallels for me around the pandemic and this tariff crisis, the economics of it. When we went back to pandemic, we had programs kick in that saved people's jobs, their livelihood, et cetera. And I know you were on the front lines cheering, saying this is great because it could prove the idea of that, basic income, there's a place for that in the conversation. But we did it because people who were doing well weren't doing well. We didn't do it because the people who needed it, as Neil just described, they didn't get it because of their need. And so we kicked in when it became a crisis for them. Earlier in the week, one of the sessions on the podcast, we had somebody commenting saying, well, now there are good paying union jobs that are at risk, and that's why all the politicians are lining up to make sure that the unions are behind them and we're going to save your jobs. I dare say a lot of the union workers, and I don't say this disrespectfully, they're in the 1%. They make some really good wage and good benefits and the good stable jobs. We're worrying about it now because they are at risk. And I'm not diminishing it, or I'm not making it an either or. But that's what's caught our attention, as opposed to Neil's point, we didn't build back better. Foundationally, we've got issues, and we're not going to deal with the heart of the problem. The worry I have is that we're going to deal with the problem in the moment, and it may last a couple of years in the moment, but it won't be a long-lasting learning.
Yeah, as others have said, there's a lot to unpack here. I want to first just stress Neil's point about, it's all of these things are related. The whole tariff thing, is affecting everybody. I'm hearing more and more concern from people that the issue of sovereignty is an even bigger threat, a more existential threat. And that feeds into what is Canada going to do in this new world? Like, where are we going? Because this stuff is not going to end quickly and it's not going to be undone. So back to the question then of who are we for? During the pandemic, it was like, we're all in this together. We're all going to fix this together. We're going to build back better. And clearly we didn't. The numbers that Neil has talked about, that's just one sector. A colleague of mine has just written an article that includes impacts on mental health that have happened and the cost of that, physical health, mental health. as a country, we are small with this like monster to the south of us. We can't afford to be kicking people out of the economy. We can't afford to be letting people languish, to not give people the capacity to be part of building what Canada needs to be. So I keep hearing things that sound like they're coming from a playbook from a different era. We really need to change the channel on a lot of this and start really looking at how we do stand together. And I'm really encouraged by like a lot of the pro-Canadian, buying Canadian, the kinds of things that we talked about. So I think there's hope there. There's some other signs of hope that I've seen over the past little while. We can talk about that. But I think we really have an existential, who are we as Canadians, and an opportunity to really distinguish ourselves from Americans in a very, very positive way.
Yeah, John, the whole idea of the mental health stress, I hadn't thought of at the top of my head, but I know a lot of people around me who are anxious, just trying to keep up with what's going on in the news, and that's, we felt that in the pandemic, but there is a cost to that we're going to have to be prepared for.
Well, sure. We're in the early days of this. It is. I think you're absolutely right. I remember the first 3 weeks of the pandemic and going through. I mean, it's really funny. After all these years, you kind of put it out of your mind. You put it in a safe and you lock it, and you don't go back there very often. But when you open it, I found it the other day when I was at the grocery store. I was standing there with my iPhone kind of going through what's Canadian, what's not. And I had this flashback of being there at, 2:30 in the morning trying to get groceries with one of my boys. And it triggers anxiety because you don't know what the future holds. You don't know whether your own job is going to be affected by it. The other side of it too is that people really want to take action. And I said to my wife last night that I remember very similarly, one of the first major studies that I did back in 1990 and 91 was around the environment. And if we remember back then, it was a big issue, but people didn't know what to do. And so the provision of the blue box gave people a huge thing to do. They actually felt like all the survey work that I did was like, take it from the curb, put it outside, take and separate your recycling, put it in there. And people actually felt that they were doing something to affect, a huge issue, which they saw as existential. Okay, so it's like throwing pebbles in the water, but it gave them a sense of what they could do. All right, now we're starting to see it. WestJet is down 25% in terms of its flights. United States trips are being canceled. You would go to the same grocery store I went to at the beginning of the week now has specials where all the Canadian coffee, all the ones that are being fairly rare and boutique, are now dropping $5-6 as they were on Monday, because now we've got demand and it's pushing the product out into the marketplace. So these are interesting times where you were right at the beginning of people making decisions on how they can get involved, whether it's booing at a hockey game or putting up a flag or purchasing something Canadian or taking a step to do something which puts them in their own place. But much at this point, where is this going to end up? I mean, is it something which is only going to last for a period of time, or is there something more structural that's going to have to happen? If that's the case, then some of the issues that Neil, was talking about at the food bank and other places, that's going to have to be addressed. I mean, this is one of those opportunities where the gate opens and you kind of look back and say, okay, well, now how are we going to define how we operate here? Because we're going to be forced to do so. And the question of how we deal with disenfranchised people, new and older ones, is going to have to be taken into account. Well,
Neil, there's going to be a lot more people lining up to add to that list of those who are disenfranchised because, 2020, you and I started to talk about the trajectory of the usage at the food bank, and you figured, well, it was not going to peak until well past 2025, but you didn't have this on your radar. So all of a sudden, I'm thinking you're into the next decade of pressure and grief.
What worries me very much is that after 2008, the highest food bank usage was around 2011 or 12. That's when it peaked, but it didn't actually go down. And so I'm very concerned that we are going to enter into a new stage where this is the norm, that 1 in 10 Torontonians has to make use of the Daily Bread Food Bank. We're going to do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. And it's a provincial election that gives us that opportunity to have that conversation. I am grateful for the debate in North Bay today, because it will be the opportunity to be able to have those questions around serious policy issues first and foremost. And the Premier will be able to defend his record, and each of the other parties will be able to outline their platforms. And it will be on topics that really matter to Ontarians, that are outside of the existential crisis that we're now facing in terms of tariffs. And as Sheila said, in terms of sovereignty. Yesterday was the first time, I watched the president's press conference in the Oval Office, and I had always just thought that the sovereignty question was just to get under the skin of Trudeau. But yesterday I was like, no, I think this guy might be serious even though I don't want to take him seriously. I think he might be.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yesterday I had the chance to talk to retired Major General Scott Clancy, and I talked to him about that very thing. And Scott sat in the chair as the Director of Operations at NORAD before he retired. And we were talking about other things, about Arctic sovereignty and so on. And it's his view that we need to take that comment very seriously in terms of where it is. And if for no other reason, it's back to your point, Sheila, it's in terms of how do we see ourselves? Where do we see ourselves in this, new world? And to John's point, how are we going to make sure that we have found other places to, whether it's buy goods, sell goods, vacation, whatever it might be, but our place in the world is at stake here. And again, then it goes back to that identity issue, mental health. There's all kinds of things that are tangled up in that.
Yeah, part of my career, I was a federal public servant for a long, long time. A lot of the work that I did was international and work with the UN. And I find it really frightening to see somebody who simply refuses not to abide by, to even acknowledge that there are rules around cooperation that makes the world function, and that makes a provincial government function, that makes a federal government function. So we really are in kind of a new world where we have to rethink things, rethink different alliances with partners who are more trustworthy. The idea of Ontario really needing to look at what it wants to be, what economic partners it might have, but how it's going to sustain its own population so that people can be part of the solution. We are spending it's part economics and part psychology. We're spending so much money on downstream consequences of all of the bad policy decisions that have not been made just by current governments, but over the last 40 or 50 years. We do have to start turning things around. So I'm, as John said, I'm looking at structural solutions, and I really do see basic income as one of those structural solutions. It's not going to fix everything. Nobody is pretending that, but we need to make sure that people in Ontario, in Canada, can be economic actors, can be social actors, can help develop their communities into those that are stronger. So I had mentioned, I want to highlight a couple of things that I think are really important about where things are going. One of the things that really has impressed me recently is the $200 campaign. So this is a very quickly organized campaign to help people find better uses of the $200 that Doug Ford was giving to people like me who don't need it. So this is the antithesis of a basic income. This is just, I don't know what it is, trying to buy votes. And they're not the only governments who have ever tried to do that, certainly. But this campaign, it's not telling you where to put your money. It's saying, tell us where you're putting your money. And I'm really encouraged by, the breadth of caring and concern about so many issues. So people are donating to food security. They're donating to health. They're donating to disability organizations. They're donating to political parties who want change. They're donating to, some are just donating individually. I mean, giving out gift cards to homeless people so they can get inside and get some food. So that tells me that Canadians are hopeful, that they want some agency, they want to be able to do something, and they think that $3 billion is better spent through some public investments in serious structural change rather than throwing money at people who don't need it.
Neil, I know you guys had that flagged on your website about 3 weeks ago. If you can, we'd be happy to put that money to good use.
Yeah, the slogan that Daily Bread created was, if you don't need your $200 rebate, we know a neighbor who does. And I think Sheila's entirely right. People are making choices there through their wallets. They're saying they're not actually giving that $200 to tear up a contract with the beer store. They're not giving that $200 to build a parking lot at Ontario Place. They are making those decisions because they see the lineups, they see the tents, they see that there are so many areas that our province is broken, and they want to contribute. The challenge that we have at the food bank really is we want to move away from it being a decision of the community and empathetically driven to a policy reaction that will result in affordable housing being built and making sure that income supports are adequate. And that's, again, why I'm excited about the debate tonight, because I think they'll actually talk about it. I am disappointed, however, that, the Liberals still don't have a costed platform out there. It's not like this election. Yes, it was a snap election, but everybody knew it was coming. And so to not have those fully developed platforms, I think the Greens are the only ones with a fully costed platform. That to me is frustrating, that they haven't been out ahead of it, and that they haven't gotten traction on what those issues are.
I want to come back and talk to you about the experience of the local candidates debate that you guys hosted this week. But first, John, I want to get into some of the numbers that Leger had, and Counsel Public Affairs TIm Hudak shared them with us in the first part of the show. And what I found remarkable about it, first, was not that there was any change effectively in the horse race number. That was pretty standard. But what I found interesting is that on all of the key issues that we've outlined, those top 5, whatever it happens to be, the Premier and the Tory government doesn't meet any level of overwhelming satisfaction among voters. They don't seem to be doing a good job on, healthcare or housing or affordability. Nonetheless, they have this overwhelming lead in public opinion polls right now that suggests that they're on their way to a romp in the election. Have you ever seen that kind of mixed message where we think you're doing a lousy job, welcome back?
Well, we actually see it almost every day with every poll. And the reason for that is in order to get a majority government, you only need 37%. So you need 37% in the province of Ontario, but you also only need it federally. So you can have, 63% of people wake up every morning and not like what you're doing and still run a country or run a province. You can get 34% and have a minority government and have a coalition with one of your political opponents and still run as if you are running a majority government. So we have an interesting situation again where you can have 70% almost of the people of a country say, I don't like what you're doing, I'm not satisfied, and yet you can still be running a country. And that's kind of what we have federally. If you take a look at the province of Ontario, you'll find that 41% believe that the government in some way deserves to be reelected. And so there you go. What did they get in the first term? The first election for Doug Ford without a costed platform was 40.5%. I think in the last election it was 41%. Right now they're tracking at 44%. And you get 41% saying that we don't all agree that you should be reelected, but based on what we have today, yes, you do. So those numbers are very, very consistent. But your point is well taken, and that's what I said right off the top. If this was not about tariffs being the number one issue of all of those issues, 53% say that is the most important issue out of all of those, and that is the one that the government is doing the best on, and that is where the leadership is needed at the moment, it would probably be a very different election campaign. But because of that, Dave, it's like a big megaphone. It's just blasting out this wall of sound on one particular issue. And the debate today may be interesting, but it turns out to be a little bit like a graduate seminar, right? Like somebody's down the hallway screaming, fire, fire, fire. And yet in the room, somebody's saying, well, let's talk about the policy of stairwells. I mean, it's not there. So, you can have this debate, but the reality is it's going to be in the 2 to 3 months that follow that it's going to be incumbent upon the leadership of not just the Conservatives in this province, but all the parties to come together and figure out how they can best align themselves. And, something like the income and, the regularized income that my dear mentor, Huey Siegel, brought in for a pilot in Ontario is something that really should be looked at. They backed away from it almost immediately when they got into power, but maybe the Conservatives, given the, what's happening with, the trade issue and some of the other issues, maybe they'll be forced to take a look at this, and it will be worthwhile to have another experiment brought in.
Yeah, that level of discussion, I can see in an academic way is, that there's a place for that, et cetera. But we're at a stage, though, now, Neil, where we need to be having these serious conversations with a view to result, with a view to solution. And, you guys had your debate on Wednesday in the middle of all that snow. And I imagine that was a bit of a challenge. But, even you lamenting a couple of weeks ago, the Tory candidate decides they don't want to participate, and that is viewed as acceptable. There's no level. It's very difficult then to have that conversation in a thorough way without having everybody at the table. So I say that knowing that was something you flagged before the debate. How did that conversation play out from your perspective? And was there anything in there that makes you think it's going to move the needle?
Well, I think I said it a couple of weeks ago. I'm disappointed that it's a bit of a winning strategy. I understand why the Conservatives are doing it, and it's frustrating because there were some 200 members of the community who came to that debate on a horrible night because they wanted to hear the policies and the platforms of each of the parties. And so and we got that from the two local candidates, Roisin Zerani and Lee Fairclough, who represented their parties very, very well. But there was one absent, and that was frustrating. It was also on the night, not just of a storm, but of a different type of storm. It was the night that the Mississauga Food Bank announced that they were doing layoffs, and they were laying off staff because the need had grown so much in that area that their finances couldn't permit them to continue to have the staffing required to serve that community. And so John, you just said, we're yelling fire, fire, fire. We are on the front lines yelling that. And it still baffles me that there isn't one party who has said there are 1 million Ontarians who now make use of the food bank. And by the time my term is finished, I promise you it will be 500,000 or it'll be 300,000, and putting out a target there and coming in and providing those policy solutions to get there.
Yeah, and that level of commitment, vision, Sheila, the problem is it's all driven by 3-4 year mandate cycles, right? What Neil's talking about is we're talking about things that are going to take us into the 30s, and that becomes the real measure of any kind of conversation or any kind of commitment or promise. It's going to take courage to do what Neil has said politically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is the problem. We are really lacking in political courage. However, again, like I mentioned, there were 3 things I see recently. One of them is that just yesterday, I think it was just yesterday, Karina Gould, who is one of the Liberal leadership federal candidates, announced that she would, if elected leader, bring in a path to a basic income. And to me, that's not pilots. I mean, most of the movement is saying, like, we're done with pilots. We know enough. The evidence is out there. We need a path to get this in. And she promised she would do that. Now, she's, doesn't have a huge amount of support, although a lot of people really respect her kind of policy credentials and her thoughts about some of this. Carney, on the other hand, has never mentioned the words basic income, but a lot of people see what he says as very consistent with basic income values and principles and capacity building and that sort of thing. So hopefully her announcement might push him and the Liberals a little bit further in that direction. I'd like to see somebody ask some Ontario party members at debates somewhere what they think about that and whether they would be willing to sit down and start working with a federal government that wanted to help bring in a policy that would help prevent the worsening of a whole lot of problems and help turn things around. And the evidence shows that this does turn things around fast. CERB, poorly designed, but in many ways, it showed how fast things turned around. Racial inequality went down. Poverty rates went down. We've got the building blocks to do this. I'd like to see, somebody from Ontario step up and do this.
Well, John, that we're back to that idea that, we've said this before, how the dynamic in Ottawa and the federal leadership of the Liberal Party is playing into the dynamic on the ground in Ontario in terms of, how the campaign's playing out. But back to the whole point of we all feel like we want to do something. And, in the pandemic, we were out there banging pots and pans for the healthcare workers. Maybe that's the equivalent to the banging of pots and pans is to say out loud, federally, provincially, somebody taking the lead on something like basic income, and this is how it works, and this is why it works, and this is the ROI as a result of doing that. If you start putting objectives and goals in front of people, as Neil says, you're more likely to get an answer as opposed to we'd like to dig a tunnel under the 401.
I think the bigger issue here is that the food banks and the social movement on that, let's say if it's a ledger, on that side of the ledger is oftentimes seen as quite isolated, and just that's the line that is taken. Like they occupy one part of an agenda. And as a result, I think what we're really missing from this is not so much us getting political leaders involved. We can get them to say things, but you and I know that they say things and oftentimes will not follow through on them or do other things. I mean, we need a broader coalition. You oftentimes will have people who are in chambers of commerce, who are in other unexpected groups who would support something like that get more attention. And again, we went through the pandemic, and at the end of it, there was no institute for clinical health and economic output. In other words, there was nothing structured at the end of the day that said, if we have this again, bird flu happening in states across the United States right now. If we get hit with it again, how are we going to make these adjustments easily so that we've got a body of knowledge and people who can practically step in? Nothing was done afterwards. We all talked about it, but nothing happened. I think, again, there's a different opportunity here to create a new grassroots. Part of it's grassroots, but the other part is leadership movement made up of disparate groups who you wouldn't necessarily expect. So if you're only going to have kind of the left of the spectrum, the food banks, the social workers, the social side of things, the NDP, that group of people with this voice, it's not going to work. If in fact you can get others who are part of the unexpected groups to start to join in and say, this is something we better prepare for, and even put it in the guise of tariffs that are coming, and that we are going to have this kind of an impact. I don't care what platform you get, but if you get something like this, you can use it to bring in those disparate voices and groups. That's where I think you start to get the traction. So, me calling it, I wanted to make an off comment just even about the debate. I wouldn't go to a debate at all nowadays. And the reason is, and I wouldn't send a candidate there, and that's because it changed from being a debate to being a screaming match and being a chant from the audience that just basically heckles. Like, why would I spend time going to a debate to get, people bussed in and put in, seats and screaming and yelling and then getting the candidates yelling? And we're going to see this in the debate, that's coming up in the province, the next big one. I mean, debates don't mean anything to a lot of people now anymore because it's just screaming matches. It's just, it's not productive. So the question in my mind is, how do you create a platform where you can have dialogue that's going to be productive, that can address some of the very issues that are legitimate that both Neil and Sheila are saying, because they can't do it alone. But they've got to find a forum where you can have that conjoining platform of disparate interests. But it sure is not going to be on a debate platform. That to me is a waste of time. And you're going to have to look at the Toronto debates for mayor. I mean, what was that? It was nothing but screaming at each other for 20 minutes, and nothing comes out of it. So I would argue that the development of another platform is absolutely critical, and it's important for the groups we're talking to today, but also the other ones to start to find that way through and maybe use tariffs and the very threat that we have right now as the spark to do so.
Yeah, John, I'll renew your. Can I just renew John's faith in debates? Come on out to the Daily Bread Food Bank next debate. I promise you some very bad coffee, but I will also promise you that you'll hear the policy positions of each of the candidates in a non-sort of screaming match. But I do get your point. I get your point that we do need to think beyond that type of platform. We need to think about, how is it that you can get complex policies out in sort of 10-second TikTok reels to people that will sort of action them. And there does need to be a reframing of that. I get your point, but there was a refined, lovely policy debate the other night.
Well, but I didn't want to single you out, and I wasn't at the debate, and I didn't know, but I mean, you're going to get the Liberals and the NDP and the Green Party all standing on a platform. I'm sure it's going to be a little less aggravating to some because you haven't got the government there, right? What I'm really saying is that the whole point of debate, since John Turner got knocked out by Brian Mulroney, I mean, we all wait for the moment and we end up with this scream fest. It's kind of like, wait a second. Does it all have to happen within the concept of a 37-day or 50-day campaign? I mean, no, of course not. Where are the bridges being built outside of this? And it's got to have a catalyst. And I truly think that we're on the precipice of having a catalyst where your voice, in fact, is echoed by somebody who you wouldn't expect. And only by building that kind of coalition that comes from voices, as I said, like chambers of commerce and leaders in certain areas of the economy that you wouldn't expect. I mean, I'm looking forward to that debate. Because I don't think we have a platform yet for it. Yeah,
Sheila, it's almost, we've said this before where we're talking about the model is broken, so we need to consider building a new model. And I think to John's point, even the debates are set up vertically. We look at a silo issue. We're going to talk to you about transportation now. Now we're going to talk to you about education. But we don't talk about how education is related to transportation, right? And so maybe we need to turn it from a vertical view to a horizontal view and to see horizontally, okay, there's more of my peripheral vision now. That's maybe the cultural change we need to have a significant, robust debate or make anything happen.
Yeah, I think it really is. And I think Tamarack does really good work at a local level, bringing communities together with this collective impact idea. I think, excuse me, I think we need to see more of that. I don't know how you do it. Again, when I was inside federal government, there were periods of time when we went through these exercises where I forget what the terminology was, but they were designed to try to make things more horizontal. And we would go to interdepartmental meetings, and the finance department people would sit there and wonder why everybody else was there, because they were going to decide in the end. So the work of building coalitions in civil society now, I think, is really important to help show governments that they need to be able to do this too. And I just want to say, I mean, we really do miss Hugh Segal enormously because he really was our entree into a lot of other, unusual places that we didn't necessarily find support. But I do see it growing. I mean, we had a major Canadian conference last year in May. We had people from across the political spectrum there. We had people from every sector. We had unions who are sometimes nervous about basic income. There were food security people, mental health people. There were business people. And one of the key themes that came out of that was that we really do need to break down the silos and look at things much more holistically.
Well, even, Neil, the number we throw around, and this is all pre-pandemic, but that $30 billion a year, that's the cost of poverty in the province of Ontario. I can't imagine what we're up to now. 80 billion is the national number. But that's a horizontal view of where those costs lie. And that's why there's a challenge, because some of it's in education, some of it's in health, some of it's in mental health, some of it's in long-term. All of these places that it shows up, there isn't one, dare I say, throat to choke on this. And, we've said in the past, if a government was doing it right, maybe what we do need is a minister of poverty, right, who's actually going to be able to be in a place where all of those things get addressed at that level.
Well, I think you look at the federal government, they have a poverty reduction strategy to reduce poverty by 50% by 2030, but there's no minister specifically responsible for that. And I understand that, because it is an interdisciplinary activity to be able to get to that point.
But isn't that set up for failure if you don't do it that way?
I just said I understand it. I don't necessarily agree with it. I do. I am maybe too hopeful that within the remaining weeks of the provincial campaign that they will put out some key performance indicators around poverty and around what their commitments are, so that each of them can have a legacy, and that legacy being driving down poverty. Because again, going back to John's point in terms of expanding the tent, you have chambers of commerce saying we need to have affordable housing so we can have workers, and that tent is I think quite big, because no Ontarian wants to see somebody have to go to the food bank, and that's the legacy that I hope each of the parties leaves with us. I was just down at President Carter's funeral in Washington a couple of weeks ago. And his past Secretary of Domestic Affairs talked about the legacy of excellent presidents, and he talked about the fact that those who sort of make the mark, their policies endure. Their policies are there long after they're gone, and that's one of the marks of a great president. And I would love to see that legacy of the premier and of the next premier, that their policies were enduring ones for the benefit of all Ontarians.
Well, I've said this before. I think you're probably the most hopeful, optimistic human being on the planet, and I think you have to be given the role that you take on daily at Daily Bread Food Bank. So let's leave it there, shall we, on a note of hope as we head into the prep weekend for the candidates and the debate on Monday night. So Neil Hetherington, Sheila Regehr, and John Wright, thank you for being here. It's always good to have your insights and thoughts and making us think of the second thing that comes to mind. All right, that will do it for us. Just a reminder, we are going to have a program, a post-debate show, and maybe some of this comment will come up in that discussion. We'll wait to see how that plays out, because we know folks are listening. We're getting actually requests from some of the lobby groups and some of the interest groups and the stakeholders across the country, in fact, who want to be on the show to have their say about how this election is playing out and affecting what it is they do in their parts of the world. So follow us on YouTube, iHeartRadio, and Apple, Spotify, all the places you listen. And as I said earlier, if there's something you want to add to the show, you want to make a comment, go to my website, davetrafford.com. On the Ledge has a talk back button. talk back to us all you want, and if it's suitable, we'll be happy to include your comment in the program. All right, enjoy your weekend. If you're in the Toronto part of the world, it looks like we're going to get another snow event, so hunker down, and away we go. Stay safe, and we'll be back at it again Monday with the, it'll be a live show on the radio, by the way, but it will be the podcast. It'll be Monday for the post-debate conversation. On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. It's the daily edition for Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.